At 3 a.m., you wake up without a clear reason? Nothing is wrong right now, but your mind is already running scenarios. You're thinking about risk, not because of today, but because of what might happen next. A car repair could happen tomorrow. Your laptop could fail this week without warning. These are small events, but with no buffer, they create immediate drawdown. This is not about overspending. It is not about laziness or lack of discipline. It is about how little margin exists between income and reality over time. One unexpected expense can shift your entire month. The timeline collapses and everything becomes reactive. That is where volatility starts to feel personal. This channel is not about fast wins or shortcuts. We break down the math behind modern money and long-term pressure. In this video, you will see the line that separates panic from control. Most people are not building forward. They are maintaining stability. Income comes in, and almost immediately, it disappears into fixed costs. Not because they are careless, but because the margin was never there to begin with. Prices tend to move quietly, but consistently upward over time. Salaries, on the other hand, adjust slower and less predictably. That small gap creates long-term pressure that compounds in daily life. You begin to evaluate every small decision with unusual weight. Eating out or cooking becomes a financial calculation, not a preference. Even fuel becomes a question of timing rather than necessity. The decisions themselves are small, but the consequences feel amplified. A minor expense can shift the rest of the week. Over time, this creates a constant low-level cognitive load. Each day starts to feel like a form of defense rather than progress. You are not building momentum, you are preventing setbacks. Stability becomes the primary objective. This is what survival mode looks like in practice. There is movement, but no real forward progress. Energy is spent maintaining position, not improving it. The difficult part is that it feels completely normal. Everyone around you appears to operate under the same constraints. When shared widely, pressure stops feeling like a problem. But this is not a neutral financial state. This is a system with no buffer, no protection against volatility or drawdown. Without margin, even small disruptions can break stability. There is a point where everything starts to shift. Not a dramatic number, but enough to change your thinking. It quietly redraws how you see risk and control. Many people assume the shift requires extreme wealth. They imagine hundreds of thousands before anything changes. But the first real shift happens much earlier. Around $10,000 is where it starts. For some, that still feels far away. But the psychological impact is immediate and measurable. This is not about becoming wealthy. It is about reducing volatility in your daily life. You move from constant reaction into something closer to control. Interestingly, your external life barely changes. Same job, same routines, same environment. But the internal pressure begins to fade. Your responses start to shift in subtle ways. Panic gets replaced by pause and evaluation. Decisions begin to reflect a longer time horizon. From the outside, nothing looks different. There is no visible upgrade or signal. But internally, the weight feels significantly lighter. This is the line few people talk about. The space between panic and control is rarely measured. And many people never quite cross it. Without savings, every decision feels like risk. Even small choices carry a heavy weight. The potential drawdown always feels closer than you expect. You stop chasing opportunities. You focus on avoiding mistakes instead. Over time, that mindset quietly limits your long-term growth. But with a small buffer, your mind starts to settle. The constant noise of risk becomes quieter. That shift changes how you process volatility. You begin to see options again. Not everything looks like a threat anymore. Your time horizon starts to expand naturally. Small problems no longer feel catastrophic. They become interruptions, not disasters. The emotional volatility begins to shrink. You sleep better at night. Not because everything is perfect, but because you know you have some margin. Confidence starts to rise quietly. Not from wealth, but from control. You feel less exposed to sudden financial shocks. And from this point, everything begins to shift. Not your life immediately, but your behavior over time. That is where compounding quietly begins. You stop overthinking small decisions. A $5 coffee no longer feels like a threat to your stability. Your focus quietly shifts toward what actually carries long-term weight. You start thinking about bigger decisions. Where you live begins to matter more than what you spend daily. Your job and direction start entering the conversation. Your mental energy becomes available again. You are no longer drained by constant micro-decisions throughout the day. The noise fades and clarity starts to return. You become more rational with choices. Decisions feel less emotional and more grounded in time horizon and trade-offs. Regret becomes less frequent because you actually think before reacting. Even your perception of money starts to change. It stops being something that disappears and becomes something that protects. You begin to see it as a buffer against volatility. This is not just theory. It reflects a pattern seen across many people over time. Once they gain space, their decisions start to change naturally. They are not more intelligent. They are not luckier than anyone else. They simply crossed a line that most people never reach. After that point, life feels different. Not perfect, but no longer constantly tight. There is finally space to breathe between decisions. Without savings, your job is not optional. It becomes something you must protect at all costs. And that quietly shifts power away from you. You avoid difficult conversations. You hesitate to negotiate or push back, because the downside feels too risky. But with a small buffer, something changes. The pressure eases just enough, and suddenly you have options. You can say no when something feels wrong. You can take small risks without panic. And you start thinking beyond the next paycheck. Strangely, people start treating you differently. Not because you changed dramatically, but because you no longer look desperate, and that subtle shift attracts better opportunities. Not instantly, but consistently over time. Almost without you noticing it happening. This is not luck, it is a shift in position. A result of having time on your side. And it all starts with a simple number. Not large, but enough to extend your time horizon. Because time is what gives you control. Not everyone reaches this point in life. It is not about discipline or effort alone. The system itself creates friction that slows people down over time. Living costs continue to rise in the background. Debt becomes normalized across everyday life. And the margin quietly shrinks without most people noticing. Many people are working harder than ever, yet their time horizon does not expand. It feels like running faster without actually moving forward. This is not just a personal failure. It reflects a broader economic structure, one that increases pressure while limiting long-term flexibility. That is why $10,000 feels significant. Not because it is large in absolute terms, but because it creates a buffer against volatility and small shocks. Because it is difficult to reach, few people get there, and scarcity amplifies its psychological impact. Even a small gap can compound into a meaningful advantage. The real divide is not wealth versus poverty. It is panic versus control in daily decisions. It is reacting to problems or planning ahead with clarity. This line is invisible in everyday life. No one points it out directly. But it quietly determines how you respond to risk over time. Maybe the problem was never you. Maybe it was the position you were placed in, and that position quietly shapes your financial outcomes over time. You are not bad at managing money. You just haven't had enough margin to manage it properly. Without space, even good decisions feel like risk. And that changes how we see everything. It shifts the story from self-blame to system awareness, from personal failure to structural pressure. The first goal is not wealth. It is distance from pressure. It is moving out of constant financial drawdown. Because after that, things begin to stabilize. Decisions become less reactive and more intentional. Time horizon starts to expand. You make better decisions with less urgency. Your direction becomes clearer over the long term, and volatility feels more manageable. It is not perfect, and it never will be, but it becomes controlled enough to breathe, and that alone changes how you live. This is what rarely gets discussed. It is not about how much money you have. It is about where you stand within the system. Maybe you are not there yet, and that is completely fine. A lot of people are still figuring it out quietly and slowly. Progress in money is rarely visible at the beginning. What matters now is that you see the line. There is a point where stress starts to fade and control begins. And that point is something you can move toward over time. It does not require perfection or perfect timing. It is built through small, consistent decisions repeated over a long time horizon. Movement matters more than speed in this phase. Life does not suddenly change when you become wealthy. It shifts when your decisions are no longer driven by panic and short-term volatility. That is when you begin to feel a sense of control. If this perspective feels familiar, stay with it, because understanding money is less about chasing more and more about reducing unnecessary drawdown. Sometimes clarity changes everything.